She rescued 2 abandoned babies by the river and raised them with all her heart. For 20 years, they were her whole world. But then, a letter arrived from a stranger, and with it, a devastating truth. The twins belonged to the richest and coldest man in the state. Now he wanted them back. What's stronger, the ties of blood or the bonds of love? Mary Lou Jenkins lived alone on the far edge of Willow Creek, where the fields rolled out like an endless sea, and the nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away. She wasn't rich or young or remarkable in any way the world might notice, but her heart was steady, and her hands, though rough from years of work, still cradled hope like a precious thing. It was a gray, muddy morning in early spring when Mary Lou rode out along the river to check the fences after the last heavy rains. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Her old mare, Bessie, picked her way carefully through the sodden ground. That's when Mary Lou saw it. A battered wicker basket tucked beneath the twisted roots of an ancient oak, half hidden by dead leaves and washed-up debris. Inside the basket were 2 tiny babies, swaddled together in a threadbare quilt, their faces red and scrunched, their cries weak but desperate against the cold wind. No note, no footprints, no sign of who had left them, or why. Mary Lou stared for a moment, frozen in her saddle, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. It would have been easier to ride away. She was a woman alone, barely scraping by as it was. 2 babies? It was madness. But instead she slid from the saddle, sinking into the mud, and gathered them up against her chest. Their tiny bodies shivered against her worn coat, their cries softened into whimpers. She didn't ask questions. She didn't wonder whose blood ran in their veins. She simply whispered, "You're safe now," and tucked them inside her shawl as best she could. Mary Lou Jenkins wasn't looking to be anyone's savior that morning. She thought she was saving them. She didn't know, not yet, that she was saving herself too. 20 years passed like a slow, steady river winding through the plains. Mary Lou raised the twins, Abigail and Caroline, the best way she knew how, with honest work, quiet faith, and a heart that never wavered, even when money was tight or loneliness crept in like winter frost at her windows. The girls grew tall and strong, full of the same stubborn fire Mary Lou had carried her whole life. Abigail, the older by just a few minutes, had a sharp mind and dreamed of one day teaching school. Caroline, quick to laugh and quicker to defend, wanted to open a bakery right there in Willow Creek. They were different in ways only a mother could tell, but alike where it mattered most. In loyalty, in kindness, in the way their hands were never too proud to work and their hearts never too proud to love. The town whispered, of course. They always had. Some said Mary Lou had stolen them. Some said the twins were the result of some scandal no one dared name out loud. A few cruel tongues even called them cursed, bad blood hidden under a good woman's roof. But Mary Lou never answered the gossip. She believed you didn't fight lies with louder lies. You fought them by living better, by standing straighter, by loving harder. By the time the girls turned 18, Mary Lou's cabin had long since stopped feeling lonely. It was a real home, battered, patched together, but full of laughter, of baking bread and drying herbs, of hand-stitched quilts and books worn soft from being read aloud by firelight. On the morning of their birthday, Mary Lou made fresh biscuits and apple butter and watched the sun climb over the prairie, gold spilling across the fields like a blessing. She thought, maybe they had outrun whatever shadows the past had tried to leave on them. Maybe life, after all its hard lessons, had finally settled into something good. But that afternoon, a rider came up the dusty lane, his horse lathered and his coat heavy with the smell of long travel. He carried a letter, a heavy envelope with an unfamiliar seal stamped in red wax. He tipped his hat, handed it over, and rode away without a word. Mary Lou held it in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it in her bones. Something in the pit of her stomach turned cold. The letter was addressed not to her, but to Abigail and Caroline Jenkins, and it was signed by a name no one in Willow Creek dared speak lightly. Baron Clayton McAllister. Mary Lou sat at the kitchen table long after the sun slipped behind the hills, the letter lying unopened between her calloused hands. The girls bustled around her, laughing as they finished cleaning up from supper, unaware of the storm gathering in the room. Finally, she called them over, her voice steady but thinner than usual. Abigail broke the seal with a butter knife, Caroline peering over her shoulder. Their laughter faded into silence as they read. The words were cold and formal, yet heavy with claims too enormous to ignore. Baron Clayton McAllister, cattle baron and landowner of half the state, declared himself their blood father. He had learned, too late, he wrote, that the maidservant he had once secretly taken advantage of had carried his children. Shamed and terrified for his reputation, he had paid to have the problem handled, thinking the twins would be quietly taken care of, gone from the world before they could embarrass his family name. But they had lived. Against all odds, they had survived. Now, 20 years later, with his legitimate heirs gone and his empire crumbling, he wanted them back. He offered them a place in his grand estate, a future of wealth, recognition, and a name that could open any door. Mary Lou kept her gaze on the table, feeling the blood drain from her face. Across from her, Abigail's hands trembled. Caroline's mouth pressed into a tight line. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Abigail whispered, "Mama, why didn't you ever tell us?" The question stabbed deeper than any knife. Mary Lou raised her head, forcing herself to meet their eyes, the same eyes she had kissed goodnight for 18 years. "Because it didn't matter," she said simply. "Not where you came from, only where you were going." The room felt too small to hold the ache that settled over them. The girls folded the letter, setting it back on the table like a thing that might still burn them if they touched it too long. And outside the window, the night closed in, cold and heavy, carrying with it the bitter truth. Blood had come calling after all these years. 3 days later, a black carriage rolled into Willow Creek, its polished wheels splashing mud onto the dusty road. It didn't belong here, not among the sagging porches and weather-beaten storefronts, and neither did the man who stepped down from it. Baron Clayton McAllister was a broad-shouldered figure in a dark coat, his silver hair slicked back, a gold-tipped cane tapping sharply against the ground as he walked. His face was carved with lines of ambition and regret, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only calculation. The townspeople watched from behind curtains and fence posts as the Baron made his way up Mary Lou's path, his boots leaving perfect impressions in the damp earth. Mary Lou stood on the porch with Abigail and Caroline at her side, their hands linked tightly behind their skirts. She didn't invite him in. She didn't offer coffee or kindness. The Baron removed his hat with a slow, deliberate motion. "You must be the woman who raised my daughters," he said. His voice was deep, polished, the kind of voice used to issuing orders and having them obeyed. "They're not yours," Mary Lou replied evenly. "Not in any way that matters." The Baron smiled, a small, humorless twist of his lips, and turned his gaze on the twins. "You girls deserve more than this," he said, sweeping a hand at the worn cabin, the rough yard, the crooked fence. "A name, land, a future. I can give you what this life never could." The words hung heavy in the air. Abigail looked down at her boots. Caroline stared hard at the Baron, her jaw tight. Mary Lou said nothing. She had always known this day might come, the day the world would try to buy what she had built with love. She had no clever arguments, no money to fight him with, no power at all except the truth that lived in the quiet years she had spent beside these girls. "You don't owe me anything," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "You have the right to choose your own path." The Baron offered a thin smile. "I'll be waiting," he said, "at the McAllister estate." He tipped his hat once more, turned on his heel, and climbed back into his carriage. The twins stood frozen as the horses pulled the black wagon away down the road, leaving behind nothing but deep ruts in the mud and a silence too loud to bear. Mary Lou turned and walked back inside the house, leaving the door open behind her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Out of love, she had saved them once. Now, out of love, she had to let them decide if they wanted to be saved again. The McAllister estate stood like a fortress against the wild hills, a sprawling mass of stone and polished wood with manicured gardens where nothing native dared grow. Abigail and Caroline arrived by wagon, their best dresses brushed clean but still plain against the grandeur surrounding them. A butler in stiff gray livery opened the heavy oak doors without a word. Inside, the house smelled of old money, leather, pipe smoke, beeswax, and something colder underneath, something that prickled the skin. The Baron greeted them in a great hall lined with portraits of men whose hard eyes and harder mouths looked down on the living like judges from another world. He led them through endless corridors, pointing out libraries, music rooms, parlors too grand to touch. Servants bowed as they passed, their faces unreadable. Everything gleamed. Everything whispered, "You could have all this. You could belong here." Abigail's eyes widened at the sight of rows upon rows of books, leather-bound and gold-lettered. Caroline caught the scent of fresh bread from a distant kitchen and thought of her own dream, a bakery, warm and bustling, a place full of laughter and cinnamon. For a flicker of a moment, it was easy to imagine themselves here, stepping into a life already built, no scrubbing floors, no endless scraping to make ends meet. But the further they walked, the colder it became. At lunch, they sat at a table long enough to seat 30, but only 3 plates were set. The Baron spoke of investments, expectations, legacies. He talked about appearances, about duties owed to the McAllister name. He smiled at Abigail's ambition to teach, but only if she taught under his patronage. He praised Caroline's charm, but only if it could be refined to suit society. Not once did he ask about the years they had lived without him. Not once did he ask what made them happy. They were not daughters to him. They were assets. By the time dessert was served, some delicate French confection neither girl could pronounce, the sweetness turned to ash in their mouths. When the meal ended, the Baron stood, tapping his cane sharply on the floor. "You'll stay here a few days," he said, like it was already decided. "There's much to arrange." He did not ask. He commanded. And in that moment, Abigail and Caroline exchanged a glance across the glittering table, a glance filled with the silent, aching memory of home, of sun-warmed pies cooling on a crooked windowsill, of quilts stitched by tired, loving hands, of laughter that asked nothing in return. They smiled politely, as they had been taught. But deep inside, something small and stubborn refused to kneel. The golden world the Baron offered was colder than any winter they had ever known. That night, Abigail and Caroline lay awake in adjoining beds inside a grand guest room that smelled of lavender and old stone. The windows overlooked endless fields trimmed into neat squares, nothing like the wild grasses back home. Caroline stared up at the carved ceiling, feeling the suffocating weight of it pressing down. "Do you think we owe him anything?" she whispered into the dark. Abigail turned her head on the embroidered pillow. "He didn't want us," she said, voice low and raw. "Not until he needed us." They lay silent for a long while, listening to the wind scrape against the heavy glass. Caroline swung her legs out of bed and padded across the cold floor. She dug into her small carpet bag, pulling out a worn square of patchwork cloth, the old quilt Mary Lou had stitched for them when they were just girls, full of crooked stitches and fading colors. She draped it across her shoulders like armor. Abigail sat up, her throat tightening at the sight of it. That quilt had wrapped them through every hard winter, every stormy night when the roof leaked, every moment they had nothing but each other. Caroline's voice trembled when she spoke. "I don't want to belong to someone who thinks love is a deal you can make over papers and gold." Neither did Abigail. In that breathless hush, a decision passed between them. Wordless, inevitable, as sure as the rising sun. They didn't belong in this cold house of mirrors and expectations. They belonged where laughter filled crooked rooms, where pies burned in ovens and mistakes were forgiven with a kiss on the forehead, where they had been wanted before anyone knew what they might be worth. Without another word, the twins packed their few belongings. They crept through the shadowed hallways, their skirts brushing marble floors that had never been meant for them. They slipped into the night, walking away from everything they had been promised. And they headed home, back to the only place they had ever truly belonged, back to Mary Lou. The sky was just starting to pale when the twins trudged up the familiar dirt path toward the cabin. Their dresses were torn at the hem, their shoes soaked through, their hands blistered from the long, hard walk. But neither of them cared. The cabin leaned a little more than it had before, the porch sagging under the weight of years and weather. Smoke curled from the crooked chimney, carrying the sharp, sweet smell of wood smoke and home. Mary Lou was outside, splitting kindling with slow, practiced swings. She looked smaller than they remembered, stooped a little more, her hair threaded heavily with gray. For a moment, they just stood there, too full of everything to move. Then Caroline dropped her carpet bag and ran. Abigail was right behind her. Mary Lou turned at the sound, her hand tightening around the axe handle in sudden fear, and then her whole face broke open in a way neither girl had seen before. They collided into her arms, knocking the axe from her hands, sobbing and laughing all at once. Mary Lou wrapped them tight against her chest, pressing her cheek to their tangled hair. "You came home," she whispered, voice cracking. "You came home to me." "We never left, Mama," Abigail said, her voice muffled against Mary Lou's apron. "Not where it mattered." Caroline clung tighter. "You're our real family. You always were." Mary Lou kissed their foreheads, her rough hands shaking with the weight of them. For 20 years she had loved them without question, without condition, and now they had chosen her, freely, fully. She pulled them back just enough to look into their faces, red from wind and tears and laughter, and smiled through her own tears. "Blood's just a word," she said softly. "But love is everything." And for the first time in a long, hard while, the cabin didn't feel small or broken anymore. It felt vast and shining and whole, like the whole wide world could fit inside that little patch of land where 3 battered hearts had finally come home to stay. A week later, the people of Willow Creek gathered in the town square for the spring fair, as they did every year. There were pies lined up for judging, quilts draped across fences, fiddles warming up in the corner by the old oak. The sun was high and kind, gilding everything in soft gold. Mary Lou stood off to the side, watching the twins laugh and chatter with their old neighbors. Abigail wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. Caroline had flour dust on her sleeve from helping the bakery booth. They looked like they belonged, not to a name or a fortune, but to this town, to these people, to her. She was content to stay in the background, as she always had. But the girls had other plans. Caroline climbed up onto the low platform where the pie judges usually sat. She cleared her throat, cheeks pink, voice shaking a little. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for the chatter to hush. "We just wanted to say something about someone who doesn't ask for thanks, but deserves more than we can ever give." All eyes turned toward Mary Lou. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Abigail took Caroline's hand and stepped forward. 20 years ago, she said, voice steady, Mary Lou Jenkins found 2 abandoned babies by the river. She didn't know who we were. She didn't know where we came from. She didn't care. She just loved us, raised us, gave us a home. Caroline's voice broke, but she pushed through. She taught us that family isn't about blood. It's about the ones who stay, the ones who love you when they don't have to. A hush settled over the crowd, thick with emotion. Abigail looked right at Mary Lou, tears shining in her eyes. "You're our mother," she said simply. "You always will be." For a moment, Mary Lou couldn't move. Then the crowd, her neighbors, her old friends, the whole town, broke into applause, warm and rough and real. Someone started a slow clap, others picked it up until it rolled like thunder across the square. Mary Lou pressed a hand over her mouth, tears spilling freely now. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the quiet woman at the edge of town. She was seen. She was honored. She was loved. And as the twins ran down from the platform to pull her into a fierce, laughing, tearful hug, Mary Lou Jenkins realized something she hadn't dared believe for a long time. Sometimes, love doesn't just heal old wounds. Sometimes it builds something stronger than anything blood alone could ever promise. Something eternal, something called home.